Hey, welcome back. Now we have patrolling behavior, and this is great. But something that you might not realize is that this patrolling behavior can become expensive quite quickly as the number of drones increases, and that's because of our overlap events. So in this lecture, we're just going to briefly go over how we can control our overlap events to optimize performance of our game. That way, once we scale this up to have lots of drones, we don't start seeing significant performance hits. Now, controlling the overlap events is quite simple. We've seen how to do this before. We can go to our drone pawn and let's select our sphere component. And we'll scroll down to the collision settings and we see that it's set to overlap everything, which means if our sphere overlaps with something, we're going to have our onComponentBegin overlap event fired off. Now, we can prove this by using a print string node here in our onComponentBegin overlap event. So we're going to say print string. We're going to get our other actor. We're going to call getObjectName and print that object name here. Now let's just see what names we get printed. I'm going to hit play. And right off the bat, we see several overlap events were triggered. Now that's because these drone pawns are overlapping with each other. As soon as their overlap spheres get an overlap event, we're seeing a message printed to the screen. Now, this is just 2 drones. Imagine a level with, say, 10 drones or 100 drones. That's a lot of computation to handle. There's a couple of messages right there. So we want to control these overlap events so that they're not triggering when we don't need them to. In fact, they only need to trigger when our character overlaps with them. So let's figure out how to do this. Now, first of all, we saw that the drone pawns were triggering each other's overlap events. We don't want that. So our sphere, it's set to overlap all types. Well, if we select our drone mesh and look at its object type, we see that it's world static. And our spheres themselves, if we look at their type, they're world dynamic. Even the explode sphere is world dynamic. Now, these are the only components on our drone that can trigger overlap events. Let's look at our character. Our character has a capsule component. Let's look at its collision type. We see that its collision object type is pawn. Now, if we select the mesh, we'll see that the mesh is also set to pawn. And if we select our gun, we'll see that our gun is world static. Now, we really only need our drone pawn to register events with one of these components. So we really don't need our mesh to overlap or really even block anything. So we're going to take our mesh, we're going to set its collision presets to custom, and we're going to click right here just under ignore to set its response to all types to ignore. We can do the same thing for our gun. We don't need our gun overlapping, so we're going to set its collision presets to custom and set it to ignore all. Now let's compile that and save. Now the only thing left that can trigger overlap events is our capsule component. And we saw that our capsule component is pawn. Now the capsule is meant to collide with things and keep us from falling through the floor, so we don't really need to mess with our capsule. Let's go back to our drone pawn and select our sphere and set its collision presets to custom. And we can set it to ignore everything except for the pawn type. So we're going to set it to overlap the pawn type. We'll do the same thing for our explode sphere. We'll set its collision presets to custom, set it to ignore all, and then overlap the pawn. So let's compile this and save and check this out. So the first thing I'm seeing is we don't get any messages. Even though the drone pawns are overlapping with each other, right there, they're definitely overlapping, they're not triggering overlap events. But if I walk up to one, it still overlaps with me because I set those collision spheres to overlap the pawn collision object type and ignore everything else. So that's going to save us on performance. And once we have a bazillion drones in our world, they won't be triggering overlap events left and right. They'll only trigger overlap events when they overlap with a component whose object type is pawn. Now, this doesn't mean that they're set to overlap pawns. Collision object types are not the same as Unreal Engine class types. These object types are just a way to organize components into categories when it comes to overlap and collision events. So again, this doesn't mean that our spheres are set to trigger overlap events with anything that's a pawn. We saw that they're no longer triggering with each other, and they themselves are pawns. They're only set to trigger overlap events with any component in the world whose collision object type is pawn. So that's a distinction to be aware of. So we don't need this print string anymore. I'm going to delete that, and as soon as I do, I notice that these nodes are no longer connected, so I need to draw a wire between them and make sure that they still work. Perfect. All right, so now that we have more fine-tuned control over our overlap events, we now have optimal performance when it comes to our drones and their overlap behavior. Perfect. I'll see you soon.